Hello, I'm Danielle DiMartino Booth, and you are watching Down the Middle with DiMartino Booth. I am so pleased today to have with me Brigadier General Robert Spalding. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, but he has also just started a new venture. He is the founder of Q Networks, and we're going to start off by asking him what he's doing with that, what that is, what the future is, and then we'll go all the way back to where it started.
Thank you. It's good to be here. So Q Networks is really an extension of what I was doing at the White House. I did a infamous study on 5G that was leaked to the media on behalf of the telecom industry. So thank you, telecom industry. And is really calling for a nationwide secure 5G network because the biggest challenge we face as a nation is security of our data.
Yep.
And so Q Networks is really dedicated to building secure 5G networks. So that's what I'm doing now, and it's actually been going for 2 years. We've completely redesigned the entire 5G architecture. We have a brand new industry unique core, and we're going to go to market next year, and it's going to be fun.
Yay, that's what we want to hear. And we will get to that and we will build up to that. But take us back first. I like to talk to people. I have a lot of degrees. At least I thought I had a lot of degrees until I saw your resume. You clearly think education is very important. I lost track at both hands, and 10, you kept going. Tell us about education in America, the challenges we face, why you find it to be so critical, and what the challenges kind of are leaving education behind, if I can say that, has presented for us going forward.
Well, I mean, this is a great topic just personally because my son recently graduated with honors at Mizzou in computer science.
Mm-hmm.
And in his category where he graduated, he was the only American. Every single other student was from China. And that's consistent around the country where, you know, our STEM programs just aren't being filled by American students.
Right.
They're being filled by foreign students, 30% of which are Chinese. Over 152,000, I think, was the last count on the Chinese students. But this goes back to, you know, what we value as a nation, and what we haven't valued, particularly since the end of the Cold War, is STEM education. Because if you value those things, you know, most of our engineers and scientists, particularly those that worked on the space program,
Mm-hmm.
were engineered on, or were schooled on the basis of federal grants, because the government knew that we needed scientists and engineers for the space race. So we were actually, when we think of, you know, national security and our investments, you know, one of the things I've never heard in a 27-year career in the Air Force, you know, all focused on national security, is the concept of opportunity costs.
Right. Right.
And so, you know, one of the things this brings up,
Mm-hmm.
right? So fast forward, I'm in the White House, and we have a $40 to $60 billion bill every single year in Afghanistan. So I asked one of the people that worked for me, I said, can you just give me 10 things that you could do with that money? One of the things that she came up with is you could educate 200,000 American kids with 4-year STEM degrees, and you could do it every single year. So think about being in Afghanistan 20 years, the amount of scientists and engineers
Mm-hmm.
that we could have trained. But, you know, so opportunity costs, what do we spend money on?
And clearly that is a multi-generational conflict that has gone nowhere.
Right, and if you think about it, what we have trained those kids to do is to destroy things,
Right.
to kill. I mean, and when you think about the Cold War, we tend to kind of focus on the nuclear weapons, but what we don't focus on is the economic development that we were doing that led to the peace. That's
Right.
the piece that we don't focus on.
And it's critical. And I think that we're going to have to, I don't know how we're going to change the narrative. I don't know how we're going to change the dialogue, but I think we're going to have to go there. Let's step back and kind of get to why it's so important. You've lived in China, and from the perspective of somebody who follows the financial markets, who follows economics, the government is very planned in how it presents its economic data. how organized is this? How important is it? What is the communication? Why is there such a scripted narrative when it comes to how China presents itself on the economic stage globally?
Well, it's a scripted narrative because if you're in the Chinese government, you get promoted on the basis of the economic growth that comes from your, whether it be province or city. And so those metrics are tied to your performance evaluation, which is tied to your career. So as you know, everything that gets measured are the things that people pay attention to. And in China, it's just the norm that you fudge the numbers. And so, it's the only nation in the world, as you know, that can predict what their growth rate's going to be within a digit or two every single year. So, I mean, this is why it's about careers, particularly for the Chinese Communist Party officials, and how they progress through the ranks. And so the numbers have to be good for them.
So, what does it mean? Because it's really a big deal for people who follow global economies. And there are a lot of implications for other countries who have that have relied on China for literally decades and decades as China has come onto the world stage, as China has built out its infrastructure. What are the implications for the world? And there's an economic angle here, and there's also very much a geopolitical angle that China has declined to what they tell us is a 3-decade low in terms of the growth that they're producing, because China has been at the margin the driver of global growth for decades now. But what does it mean? Because their government has to know what it truly is. But what we know publicly is that China has slowed to a 30-year low growth rate.
Right. Well, first of all, let's talk about the system that they've built, because I think that's important. As we know, access to capital is what drives economic growth. And so what the Chinese Communist Party has done, in China, there's 2 constitutions. There's the Chinese Communist Party Constitution, there's the People's Republic of China Constitution. We've mostly focused on the People's Republic of China Constitution. And when you think of the People's Republic of China as the sovereign, then you get this image of this democratic republic. But in reality, because there's 2 constitutions, the one that's actually the sovereign is the Chinese Communist Party. So what does the Chinese Communist Party control? They control the military, they control the borders, they control the police, and they control the banks. And so, and really of those, the most important are the banks. Right. And so if you go from the standpoint that access to capital is what drives economic growth, and you have a regime that has basically created a system that uses access to capital to get what they want. In other words, they incentivize behavior that is in their own interests. And that behavior is wealth creation and economic growth. Then you can create a lever that allows you, in a globalized world where we have free markets, where we have an open financial system, global financial system, it allows you to basically take control of that. And you take control of it not just for, because you mentioned geopolitics, not just for economic growth, but also for geopolitics, also for social control. This is the power. So, and this is why, by the way, during the Cold War, we did not allow the Soviet Union to be embedded in our multilateral democratic system. It was only after the end of the Cold War we said, okay, you guys come all in. We're gonna bring you into this arrangement, and then you're gonna democratize, because you're gonna see it's such a wonderful benefit for you and your people. Well, totalitarians don't think that way. Right. They're like, wait, you're going to let me into your house?
You're going to let the fox into the hen house. This is so awesome.
Your refrigerator is full and I can come and do whatever I want. And essentially that's what they did. And so when you take that and then you back up to the first quarter of 2018. So the first quarter of 2018 is when the National Security Strategy, which comes out in December of 2017, begins to be implemented in earnest. In other words, all of this, hey, come on in, use the fridge, do whatever you want, pretty soon there's a padlock on the fridge. Pretty soon that, you're restricted in what you can do and where you can go. That, the federal government begins to close down on that. Part of that is and I remember there was absolutely nobody believed that we were going to put tariffs on China. And so part of that is beginning to close access to certainly the U.S. and then go work on a bilateral basis with allies and partners to say, okay, we're closing the refrigerator, we're restricting their access, we think you should too. And in fact, if you want to have access to our military protection, this is going to be a requirement going forward. So now we're fully 3 years into that implementation process. Mm-hmm. And so you're beginning to see, it's not about the coronavirus, it's really about the slow constricting of access in the very same way that the Soviet Union was treated during the Cold War. So you're basically seeing a shift, a geopolitical shift, into a more recognition from a unipolar world to a bipolar world, not a multipolar world, which is what everybody was kind of predicting, that we're going to go from a unipolar world to a multipolar world.
And I think
in reality,
a lot of people
it's a
would
bipolar.
Like that.
They would like that.
Yes.
But it's a bipolar world where China and the U.S. kind of are the lead planets, I guess, in their own orbital system.
Well, they are the superpowers. And even if you think of Germany, for example, as being kind of the third largest economy in the world, it's neck and neck with Japan right now. Germany is the economy that it has become because its manufacturing machine has largely become dependent upon China.
Right.
So it wouldn't be where it is right now if it wasn't for that symbiotic relationship in between its industrial base and the needs of its main customer, if you think about it that way. But on a geopolitical level, the IMF right now is involved in bailing out, I want to say 74 countries worldwide. And I get people who follow me closely know that if you call this the coronavirus recession, my fangs come out because it's not. It is a black swan economic event that exposed a lot of leverage.
Right.
And in many cases, a lot of these countries that are being bailed out by the IMF were aided and abetted in becoming as over-leveraged as they are via Chinese banks. And I doubt in a million years that China figured it was going to end this way, that they were going to be under a microscope in the year 2020 being told by world authorities to stand down and that they cannot collect on their debts because these countries are on their knees in many ways. So has the quiet colonization gone awry? And are we paying enough attention to this? Because this was a big part of their grand plan.
Right. Well, so bring the World Bank into it. I don't know if you remember, but World Bank basically signed up to in perpetuity giving them $1 billion, giving the Chinese $1 billion, because of just about every other international institution, the World Bank's been taken over by the Chinese. No, I don't think they were expecting this. That being said, you still have hundreds of billions of dollars making their way into China through the IPOs that are going on in Hong Kong. XPeng just did $1.5 billion IPO on the New York Stock Exchange despite having stolen technology from Apple and Tesla. And then you got the Chinese bond market is booming. So it's not just about the IMF. Wall Street, London, Berlin, they're all sending money to China, and that's what's kind of feeding this thing. So I don't think it's stopped quite yet, because the door hasn't shut yet. And that's really the thing. If this Belt and Road Initiative was to rely solely on the currency that the Chinese Communist Party could create, that I think does less than 2% of transactions globally, even today, that would fall apart in a heartbeat. What they need is hard currency, because hard currency gets them the raw materials and resources that allows them to continue on the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is our big problem. And it's one of those things where I keep saying, the first thing you do is you find yourself in the bottom of a hole is to stop digging.
Right. And yet, and we know the power and the lure of investment banking fees. But when you think about what's happened in Hong Kong and the situation and how it has evolved, why on earth would they even risk cutting off such an important international conduit to their own liquidity?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think that they do find that at risk, because here you have a country where there's effectively been a one country, two system policy that clearly said, no, we're going to have one country, one system. Mm-hmm. We have said, State Department has said, you're no longer sufficiently autonomous. But yet, how has the Fed and the Treasury reacted? The Hong Kong Monetary Authority still produces a Hong Kong dollar, still exchanges it for the US dollar. So in effect, the Chinese Communist Party has two currencies. They have what is considered a freely exchangeable currency in the Hong Kong dollar. This is how they get hard currency. And then when it gets into the mainland, it's exchanged by the People's Bank of China for renminbi, and then the Communist Party takes their cut. The money goes wherever the Communist Party wants it to go. When you raise money on the New York Stock Exchange, it goes to that company. Mm-hmm. If a Chinese company raises money on the New York Stock Exchange, it goes to the People's Bank of China. Who controls the People's Bank of China?
Right. So that kind of brings me to where Chinese authorities want to go next. Right now, there are very few options. The provinces inside the country are very weak still. It is just the big three exporting monsters that are doing well, the same way we talk about there being a K-shaped recovery here in the United States. There's an equal K-shaped recovery in China right now. And they've got a serious issue with unemployment that we, of course, don't know about, but we do know about it. What they're doing is going back to their very old playbook. They're pouring money into infrastructure spending. They finally stopped buying copper, but they've been buying up iron ore. And this is what they did. This is what they did in the 90s. This is what they did in the aftermath of the financial crisis. But is this just a stopgap measure? And what does it imply for Australia and Chile and Brazil and other countries that seriously rely on China to support their economies when we know that India is not a viable next place to go in terms of a demographically attractive country that needs to come out of the third world era in terms of its own infrastructure? But India's not there yet. So what are the implications for the countries that have relied on China for decades now? And where does China really want to be spending its money today?
So the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, is a good indicator of where they're going. And I think what they're trying to do is essentially connect resources to productive capacity to markets. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be tightly integrated with the Belt and Road Initiative, which has a maritime component, it has a landward component, and it has a digital component. And so the idea is essentially to connect these countries that have the resources to the productive capacity of China, to offload some of that productive capacity, particularly in low value-added products in those countries, and create basically an economic sphere of influence that is paired with a social and political system that they are comfortable with. And so what's happening is, because of what America is doing in terms of resetting the way it deals with China, and it's doing so along with its allies and partners, essentially the democracies are beginning to come together like they did during the Cold War, and they were very tightly integrated. In fact, there was just a report talking about this idea of a technology D10, right? The democracies 10 coming together for artificial intelligence, 5G. It was in there's a report coming out that talks about this, and has to do with 5G and security. That's going to be the democracies. What China has in mind is the emerging market economies and the authoritarian regimes. So we're talking about Middle East, we're talking about Africa, talking about Latin America, we're talking about Central Asia, and the four horsemen: Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. So that is what they have in mind. And so this idea of a digital currency goes right along with half the undersea cables that Huawei has laid, with the digital Silk Road, the building of 5G networks, the ability to control the populations using technology that Silicon Valley built. All of this is meant to have this arrangement where kind of China's at the core, and it provides the capital via, the renminbi, which will be part. So it is a closed, financial system, but it's extending that firewall for that financial system to the countries in its orbit. It did so in the beginning through bilateral currency exchanges, which it also did with democracies. Those are going to go away. So those currency exchanges are going to exist, and most likely what I'm guessing with the introduction of a digital currency is that they're going to try to basically create this greater firewall with a digital currency that allows this kind of economic activity in the way that they've thought about it, which is the people in charge stay in charge and everybody else are subjects.
Well, it sounds like they're going after places where they can take control effectively.
Right.
It truly sounds like you're talking about, well, the word you used before. This is a bifurcated type of future that's being envisioned between the developed countries and the less developed countries. It was fascinating to me that Australia went so far as to head a coalition of countries demanding an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, given that China has done so very much for Australia. But I think their first recession in 30 years, and the fact that there's so much debt that's been built up, and some of the buildings that the Chinese have come in and built are flammable. And so I visited Australia for some time. I think they're realizing that it was a deal that wasn't necessarily made with their ally. But you are starting to see the developed world countries push back against 5G. But they all seem to be natural allies of the United States. The question is, in the end, which of the two is larger? Which of the coalitions is larger?
But see, this is the entire play, and this is exactly, by the way. So I asked to meet with Liu He before I left Beijing, which is probably kind of presumptuous for a defense attaché. But I wanted to explain, what was coming, because I was being asked to go back to the White House to help, work on this strategy, and I could see this all entirely in my mind, this competition coming between, you think your system is better, we think our system is better. The problem is you've been taking from our system to make your system work. What happens when we cut that link? How does your system continue to function? And I think that's where, so access to capital drives economic growth. You can paper over a lot of things in terms of economic efficiency with state-owned enterprises. When you're taking the most of the capital, access to capital that's driving new investment. When you cut that, now they have to start to stand on their own 2 feet, which is state-owned enterprises, which is government control, fine control over how
pouring money into them.
Right. So it's terribly inefficient. We know it's inefficient. We've been giving them money to run it. So it's like your neighbors. You've got a Prius and your neighbor's got a gas guzzling Humvee, but he keeps coming and taking gas out of your tank to keep himself going. And we said, hey, we're not going to. So I said, hey, let me meet with you. And I talked to him. I said, you guys have been taking advantage of us for so long, but I think it falls on deaf ears. They actually believe that their system is more efficient. And I think Liu He knows that this is not right. I think he knows it's incorrect. But of course, Xi Jinping is thoroughly convinced that no, this is definitely the way that we want to go forward. So when you talk about,
he appears to have true autonomy. He appears to have more control than any leader has in decades.
Because he's more communist than any Chinese leader has ever been. So he's a leader of the Chinese Communist Party. You could almost say he is the Chinese Communist Party. If you said, okay, you look at all the rhetoric, who believes this stuff most fervently? That would be Xi Jinping, which is why he finds himself kind of uniquely in charge in China, is because he so much believes in that system. But the problem is the system doesn't work. It doesn't work if it doesn't have us putting innovation, technology, talent, and capital into it to drive it. And so so they actually decided to cut it. It wasn't, so we talk about decoupling. Now, even in my best day, I could not have, predicted that Liu He would take the 150-page agreement that he and Lighthizer negotiated, go to Zhongnanhai, and then have the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party say, absolutely not. My greatest fear was they were going to say yes, right? Which would have put the brakes on all of this. What they said is, no, we've made it. This system works. We've built this Belt and Road thing. We're just going to separate ourselves because we have all we need. In the meantime, we'll try to, before they shut the door completely, we'll try to get everything that we can.
But you can see in the economies of Massachusetts, you can see in the economies of California that their service exports, in other words, bringing Chinese into their universities, have suffered. I mean, there is whether it's by the design of the CCP or not, there is a cultural backlash against the United States that hadn't existed prior to that. And I mean, it brings up the question, can they home grow their own talent? Do they have the MITs? And we know that they've got the focus on STEM education that we should have, but can they take it to the next level? Can they build out AI capacity? Can they build out a better 5G network? Or, as you say, is the reliance on the United States a linchpin that therefore is going to become a stumbling block for them going forward?
Well, the Soviets had great technology. What the Soviets didn't have was a good economic system. Again, I think the cutting of this linkage between China and the free world will expose their economic system. So can they produce the type of people that they need to produce? Yeah, I think they can. But my sense is as that tie becomes cut and their system begins to close in upon itself, that will not continue. So I think that what I'm saying is we've reached peak China. Now it's going to begin to slowly erode because the system doesn't work.
And demographics aren't exactly helping them either.
And by the way, that's another part of the Belt and Road Initiative, because everywhere you go, when you look at these low value added manufacturing, what's going with it? 10,000 Chinese citizens. So they're dealing with their demographics, which is primarily heavily weighted in males because of the one-child policy and the tendency to abort the females. So you have this, over leverage in males, and so they're starting to move those out as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And you see this in Africa and you see it in Central Asia.
I don't think the African nations necessarily appreciate this methodology, if you will, because in terms of organic fundamental growth for their economies, China coming in, I believe there are a lot more promises than what is realized, because they're not coming in and creating jobs. They're not coming in and raising up the education and the know-how and the technical capabilities of the populations of the countries. They're bringing their own labor.
Right. Well, and this is part of the effort on the State Department and Commerce Department to work with these countries to say, hey, look at the contracts that the Chinese are bringing you. Most of them say, I think all of them say, the laborers have to speak Chinese. They don't say they have to be Chinese, they just have to speak Chinese. And so, well,
that's one of your many degrees, and you know it's not that easy.
That's right.
All four of my children take Mandarin. It's not an easy language.
Yeah, and not for their people. And so, and what ends up happening is, just like you're saying, it ends up being Chinese laborers, and so they don't actually benefit from it. But who does benefit? And this is really goes back to the point about access to capital. The ones that benefit are the leaders of these countries. And so, when you say, well, the people aren't going to be taken care of, well, that's not, the Chinese don't care about the people. They care about getting alignment of interests with the leadership. So if you get alignment of interests, then it begins to be part of this overall system. I don't care what your politics are. This is the way a Chinese diplomat would look at it. I don't care what your politics are. Can I give you some money and we can be friends? Of course, that works.
If you think I lived in Venezuela for a short period of my life, pre-Chavez, and if you think about it, that's kind of what happens. That's really what the playbook looks like. But the playbook does not end very well when you end up saying, I'm going to build out an economic empire by spreading corruption worldwide in weak countries.
Well, yes, as long as the rest of us don't keep throwing our money and technology and talent and innovation into it, you're right. It's going to end badly. It's going to end badly for China. It's going to end badly for Russia, for Iran. It's all going to end badly. It's just how long does it take for it to end badly?
Well, okay. So you're asking a great big question here. How do you put a seatbelt on Wall Street?
Bingo.
I mean, that's what you're suggesting.
Well, yes, but as you know, fiduciary responsibility is built into our system, but yet somehow the Chinese have escaped any liability for fiduciary responsibility. And again, it goes back to the point you made about fees for things, right? And Wall Street's making enormous fees. And
they're making fees in these countries that are their targets as well. A lot of them splash onto the front page of the Wall Street Journal. There's bankers here and there, and they're bribing officials. You're like, wait a minute, that is how business is done.
In our system, who monitors, who has oversight of Wall Street, and where? This is one of the things that I learned about my whole episode with the telecom industry, right? The industry has enormous control over DC in terms of their ability to get the kind of policies they want. So you look at Treasury and SEC, the ones that should be reining in this infatuation with China, and they're both tightly connected to Wall Street. And so that's what's going on. Everybody knows it. And the president, had to step in so that their savings plan, the retirement system for active duty military, wasn't being invested in weapons manufacturers in China that they would have to face. So that's where we are right now. If we could break this tie, what I would call a stranglehold of Wall Street over, those that are supposed to do oversight over the industry within DC, then I think everybody would wake up and realize, okay, this is insane. We cannot send hundreds of billions of dollars into this because, first of all, just like in Venezuela, that money's gone. It's not coming back.
No.
And it's going to be put into hard assets that the Chinese want for the system that they're trying to build. And why, for the life of me, I can understand why we would continue to do this other than our system is just as corrupt as theirs in some ways.
I was about to say greed is good where I started my career, and that's going to be something that's very difficult to. It's a culture. It really is. Shift gears for a minute. Put your 5G hat on. We're starting to see some of our allies push back against Huawei, push back against their systems effectively being infiltrated. Do you think that we can turn this around to where Chinese don't literally have the keys to the kingdom and the ability to spy on everybody? So
it goes right to the same problem of Wall Street, and it's industry. Industry has a stranglehold on
and theoretically the City of London.
Because if you think about it, what the United States started with this auctioning of spectrum and the rise of the telecommunications networks, those have essentially become toll roads that the telecom operators maintain. And they were, in the beginning, it kind of made sense because the technology kind of required that you built networks this way. But as technology, evolved, we found our stuff, and we find ourselves today stuck on toll roads when in reality we could open up this vast swath. It's like It's like that scene from the movie Independence Day where he's driving all the RVs across the desert, and you've got this salt lake, bed that you're driving on. You have all of this space.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we have in Spectrum. That's what technology can actually give us access today.
Yeah.
But the telecom industry says, no, I want to keep you on my toll road. And so that's why we
and the real
have
estate
such a problem.
developers say, get rid of the toll roads. That's great property. We can develop it.
But here's the deal. Here's the brilliance of that whole idea. It actually plays into Huawei because they're stuck on these toll roads,
mm-hmm.
and they're rickety, and they don't have the latest equipment. But what incentive do they have to build on it, because they haven't made their investment back from 4G?
Right.
So along comes Huawei and says, hey, I'll sell that to you. Hey, I'll give it to you. Why? Why
mm-hmm.
would they give you the infrastructure? Why would they build it for you? Because what Silicon Valley found out is it's not the toll road. It's the data that rides on the toll road.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the value is. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
that's what they want. They want the data.
Greg Ip had a great story in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, and he basically plotted out on a graph and showed that Huawei's got almost a third of global telecommunications equipment in its possession, almost a third. If it gets to 50%, it will effectively be globally dominant. And this is the data gathering equipment that we're talking about here.
Right. So the stock multiple on AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile. You also know the stock multiple on Facebook, Amazon, and Google,
mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
They're not in the same class.
No, they're not in the same zip code. No.
So one has got toll roads,
mm-hmm.
and the other one's got data.
Right.
Okay, so the Chinese look at this and they say, the Americans dominated 4G. The guys that built the toll roads didn't make any money, but the guys that took the data and built the app services and business models on top of those toll roads, they're the ones that cleaned up. We cannot break into that. Why? Because the two companies that control the platform for that are Apple and Google, mm-hmm. Android and iOS. And they're like, even Huawei, as hard as Huawei tried, they could not break into that because they have the dominant position.
Well, they're called monopolies for a reason.
Exactly. So what did they say? They said, well, we're not even going to go there. We're just going to go to the next thing. And the next thing is not a smartphone world. So Android and iOS don't get to play.
Right.
It's about cameras and machines and everything connected.
Go it.
So they're just basically going, and they're basically doing an end around. And their business model is this. Huawei, you go build the roads. Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent,
mm-hmm.
they'll be the monetization arm, right?
Right?
They'll take the data, they'll monetize it. But it's not just for economic growth, it's also for social and political control, because that's the way their system is.
Right.
And then Huawei will just force Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent to fund your effort, right? So
makes sense.
If you were going to do the same thing in here in the United States, what you do is you tax the tech companies
mm-hmm.
to pay for a new nationwide, really great 5G.
Can we do that?
Well, we could if we wanted to, but we don't. We don't want to. We want to allow...
Why can't we want to? I mean, why can't we make it a matter of national security to want to?
Well,
I mean,
we are... So I get to the White House, and my colleagues at the National Economic Council, when I say, hey, we need to do some industrial policy, says, no, America doesn't do industrial policy. I said, well, there's other nations that do, and we're getting our ass handed to us because we're not. And so the recent congressional report even that came out from the Republicans that did a report on the China study, if you look in the report and you look at what they did for 5G, there's nothing in there. Why? Because the telecom industry does not want the federal government to tell them how to build the next network. Oh, by the way, they're not actually building the next network because they are stuck in 4G. They're stuck on the smartphone. And what China did is said, okay, China Unicom, China Mobile, in the past we've let you build your own networks. You guys are going to build one network and you're going to share it. Remember what I said? Because the technology now allows you to open up vast swaths of spectrum, and if you build more than one physical network in your country, so think about this. You have two companies. This one has to spend $1 billion, and this is a notional small country, so he spends $1 billion building a telecom network. This one spends $1 billion on a telecom network, and then they're fighting for customers. Meanwhile, the customers get half the speed, and what else? They pay twice the price. So half the speed at twice the price, because the throughput, when you break them up like that in separate physical networks, it doesn't make economic sense. So so for us in the United States, our CapEx is 4 times, our OpEx is 4 times, and our speed that the customer sees is 1/4. This is the technology. This is what the technology has given us, but our industry models today are based on old technology. The Chinese, I'm pretty sure they read my report and said, okay, China Unicom, China Mobile, you're going to build one network, you're going to share it.
Yep, and be efficient about it. In our family, we've got one person has AT&T and the other person has Verizon for when we travel. So when one person loses coverage, the other person has it, and that's kind of a very real world example of what's taking place. So we're talking about money. We're talking about capital. We're talking about money leading to control on a geopolitical stage. So is there any merit to what is happening in the South China Sea? Do we need to be worried about Taiwan Semiconductor, about Taiwan, about what is happening in China's military? And where we're eventually going with this is he who rules the sea. And the whole idea of reserve currency status, because in the history of mankind, going back to the Roman Empire, it's never been lost if there's just been a currency war, or if a currency war has escalated to a trade war. It's only if you get to that third step where it escalates to a hot war that the currency itself is at play and at risk. But as you just said, less than 2% of global transactions are being done. However, they're looking for a workaround. So I'm curious if it is just saber rattling or if it's something that the world needs to be paying closer attention to, because prior to the current administration, there were many times that it was brought up before world tribunals and said what China's doing is in violation of international law, and yet nothing has been done. Nothing has still been done.
So, South China Sea. The Chinese Communist Party told the People's Liberation Army back in the 70s, hey, the Vietnamese are starting to move into these islands in the South China Sea. We need to do something about it. And PLA told the Chinese Communist Party, we don't have the resources. We don't have aircraft carriers. We don't have we can't sustain any kind of effort down there, because how are we going to fuel our ships? How are we going to keep them operational? So that's in the 70s. Fast forward to 2013, 2014. Now they finally have the resources, and so they start building the islands in the South China Sea. So the whole point of the islands in the South China Sea is that
this is fed by the Russians, the technology, military.
In terms of
helping build the actual aircraft carriers themselves.
Oh yes, but I mean in essence the islands are just basically aircraft carriers that don't go anywhere. Mm-hmm. So they basically built islands.
Stationary aircraft
right,
carrier.
They're stationary aircraft carriers because hey, they have dredgers, they can dredge up sand, they can make islands. The whole point of that was it was a long-term strategy by the People's Liberation Army to answer what the Chinese Communist Party told them, which is get control of the South China Sea. Mm-hmm. So now they have the islands, they have ships down there, they have planes down there, and they can begin to coerce their neighbors and say, this is ours. The resources, the fish, the natural gas, the oil, all of it is ours.
And those are international commercial lanes. Nobody can have control of them.
They're actually, according to the Chinese, it's the Chinese lake, right? They own it. But this is getting to your point about do I think there is a potential for a hot war? So I don't think there is right now, but the risk is increasing. Now, the thing that I think keeps the Chinese at bay from the United States is the same thing that keeps the U.S. at bay with regard to Russia, and that's nuclear weapons. So nobody else in the region has nuclear weapons. So the Chinese Communist Party feels pretty safe just going around and bullying their neighbors because nobody has nuclear weapons. Who is going to oppose them? And so I can expect that you're going to see more and more of this as time goes on. As you lead into this this question about is there going to be a change in the reserve currency? I don't think so, because the Chinese aren't willing to allow their currency to float, and there's no way that anybody's going to want to take the yuan if the only way that they can exchange it is to go begging at the People's Bank of China. So I don't think that. So are we going to have a hot war between kind of the United States and China? I don't think so because of nuclear weapons, number one. Number two, I don't think the Chinese are going to get exchange or reserve currency status, except within that economic sphere that I talked about with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Which is very demographically, that's some of the best demographics in the world that you described.
Right. So, and this gets back to the competition. So when I talk to people about what the national security strategy says, it's really about three things. Protect, and that's really, we got to cut that link. We got to stop that stuff flowing. Rebuild. Okay, since innovation, technology, and talent's not going to China, now where can it go? The United States, other democracies, right? And then inspire. And this is really where we get back to what we were doing in the Cold War, kind of like the Marshall Plan, right? We take USAID, Export-Import Bank, Trade Development Agency, Developmental Finance Corporation, Millennium Challenge Corporation. We work with allies and partners, and we begin to, at the same time that we're doing economic development, very much like the Chinese are doing, because they have been very strategic about how they develop economically. But at the same time, we're doing public diplomacy. We're talking about the values and principles that go with our system. And we do that strategically, on the fringes of where the Chinese have basically grabbed territory. Because the third part is called inspire. You inspire the people that are behind the curtain by saying, we have a better life for you. Not only do we have better economic growth, but you can do it in your way.
Right.
You're free to be who you want to be. Right. Yeah. You can meet your true potential. This is what we were doing during the Cold War. We were inspiring people. It wasn't about fighting. It was about showing that we had a better system for humanity. And what happens is, as you begin to do that, because when you brought China into the tent, the system began to fall apart. And we didn't recognize it. The stock market's growing, people are getting wealthy, but
we quietly learned that lesson in the Korean War.
Others are getting poor.
We just didn't take enough away from the Korean War.
Right, but that was kind of a microcosm of what we're talking about here, which is total systemic collapse. And so you have to basically begin to heal that system. And as it grows up, and as you help certain other emerging market economies that actually want to go a different way. But if you look today in terms of what USAID does in Africa, just look at water. Congress gives them water for a certain country. You have this pot of money for a water project in Nigeria, for example. Because I went to USAID, I said, what's your strategy for development in Africa? And they looked at me like, what are you talking about? What the Chinese do are say, identify a resource, build the way to get that resource, identify a port, connect them with roads and rail, telecommunications, power, water. Now what do? They start putting in low value added manufacturing, urbanization to support the workers that are working in the factories. Now you've got you've gone from a backwater to industrial economy to information economy, $50 smartphones, you're using WeChat, Tencent, Alibaba, all of these companies this begins, now you've got an information economy. And when we do development—
And a populace that's beholden to you, by the way.
Exactly. And so when we that's what we did, if you think about it, that was the Marshall Plan.
Yep.
It's exactly what we did, except rather than, being piecemeal like we've been for the last 30 years, it was focused. It was about building the civil society. At the same time, we were building a comprehensive, economic capability that was tied to the United States. We stopped doing that at the end of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And that's the same time the Chinese came in and said, okay, you're not going to do that. But that's a great idea. We're going to do it, and we're going to tie it to our way of looking at the world. And it's worked for them beautifully because our business sector and our financial sector has actually been involved with them doing that. That's what when McKinsey gave me the report in the White House that says, hey, we should partner with Africa or with China in Africa. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I asked him, I said, who did you interview for this report? The business owners? Who are they? Chinese? Who else? The leaders of the countries, authoritarians. Who else? Did you interview any of the people? I literally asked them that.
Right.
And they said, well, I asked a taxi driver here and there. So
that is, and you actually get to kind of the incestuous nature of Wall Street and the consulting firms that they deal with all the time. But it's affirmation bias. You might as well be conducting really expensive research inside of a vacuum, because that's as much value add as you're going to get out of it. Sorry. But a country's name continues to pop into my mind, and that is India. It would seem that if there are any global allies that are, for lack of a better term, up for grabs, that there is a ton of focus right now on the potential in India, that, by the way, has more people in it than China, and they're a lot younger. It would seem to me that somebody in Washington, D.C. needs to be hyper-focused on building a fantastic relationship with a country that has always assisted our service economy. And I have friends who have entire workforces in India and can't speak highly enough about their work ethic and their adoption of education. But it would seem to me that in addition to everybody we consider to be our traditional, if you want to go back to the Cold War, the old Cold War, everybody who was on our side then, plus India, seems like we've got a fighting chance. Plus there's a lot for American companies to go in and do economically. I mean, when you think about I'll go back to the Korean War for a minute. The Japanese economy was on its knees. But we were occupying it at the time. And we, logistically speaking, we couldn't get everything we needed to fight the Korean War. So what do? We fired up the industrial base in Japan, and it ended up being a win-win because Japan ended up becoming obviously one of our great allies, and Japan does not trust China to this day, and that's not a bad thing. But I hate to have thrown a question at you that you may or may not have an opinion on, but it seems to me that we need to be strategic in looking at peaceful countries with great economic potential.
There's a good book by John Pomfret called Beautiful Country and Middle Kingdom, and I think it's a great read, and it really tracks this kind of a love-hate relationship between U.S. and China. And it's an odd pairing, but it's been since the beginning of our country that we've had this fascination with China. We haven't had, of course, India was a British colony, and maybe we thought that we had more of an in China because India was all Britain. But I don't know the answer to the question, but I do know that if we don't get Wall Street and the corporate sector as infatuated with India as they have been with China, then we don't get anywhere. That's the problem that I see in the government. You have to get the private sector to want to be there. And if the private sector wants to be there, and I'm talking about the U.S. private sector, then you're going to see the money go there, you're going to see the businesses go there, and you're going to see, and as that relationship strengthens, I think you're going to get the kind of reaction. But to date, we haven't, even in what we're doing with regard to the federal government, we haven't got the private sector enthused about it. And we don't think...
Because China's definitely got their eye on India. Without a doubt.
Right. We don't think holistically about strategy. We don't think holistically about, how do we achieve our objectives? The Chinese think holistically. They I've got all this economic capability and I've got military. What do? They say, well, I'm going to rely on this. This is to keep people out of my backyard. This is really to grow my geopolitical leverage.
Right.
What have we done?
One system feeds the other.
Right. And we basically said, hey, you corporate America, Wall Street, you go off, do what you want. We're gonna go out and use these security relationships to kind of get what we want. No, it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Countries want economic growth. Their people need economic growth. If we led with that, then our relationship with India, I think, would flourish. I agree. India is the natural relationship for the United States. It's a democracy, for heaven's sakes. Yep. It's not a totalitarian regime. They don't do organ harvesting. They don't lock up Uyghurs, in prison camps. Now, there's some that say, hey, well, there are some challenges. Well, there's challenges everywhere. But compared to China, there's no vote. But the only thing that I can say is that we have had this, sort of unnatural fascination with China as a nation. Mm-hmm. And I think John Profit does a good job of explaining that.
I've got a great chart that we can throw up that shows that within 9 years, China is going to have a third of all semiconductor manufacturing in the world. What helps us as a nation? What helps us in terms of building a government relationship with industry, try and combat that tide? Because it seems like we need to do this starting in the classroom, first of all, starting with our young ones, but all the way up to building better relationships with Silicon Valley, with Raleigh-Durham, the next Silicon Valley. But how are there efforts? Are there discussions about efforts in Washington, D.C. to make this happen? Because listening to everything you're saying, it seems like we're just asleep at the wheel, or the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. I'm not going to throw a third cliche out there.
So we spend $800 billion a year in defense. The biggest lobby for Huawei in D.C. is the semiconductor industry in America. Why? Because their talking point is, let us sell chips to Huawei. They buy so many that enables us to do R&D that makes us better. Okay, I think what people have missed is that the most powerful semiconductor company in the world right now is TSMC. It's a Taiwan company. Taiwan,
yeah.
Qualcomm doesn't make semiconductors. They design them. That's only part of the process. 70% of the innovation comes out of the production process itself. Okay, so we've lost that capacity to be the leading semiconductor producer in the world. Taiwan has it. What do we need to get back? Well, again, I'll go back to the Cold War because it's such a great example. We were spending 1.7% of GDP on science and technology.
I'm going to go home and watch Hidden Figures and Apollo 13 and Armageddon. I'm going to sit the kids down and have them watch these movies.
It's all there. The strategy was wonderful, and it was really started by Eisenhower, if you think about it. And what is he? He's an army guy. Says, okay, we can fight it out, or we can use our system to beat him.
Well, he saw Stalin, and he knew what the capacity was for potential destruction, and what patience does in leadership roles, and that's the role that China's played. China's played the patient superpower, and we're like the schizophrenic one, in a way.
Well, what Eisenhower realized is that if we can use our military to deter conflict, if we can postpone a real war, we don't want to get back into that, and then use our science and technology and economic growth and our freedom to innovate, to really grow up our society, well then over time, we're going to win.
Right.
And what happened was we lost sight of that. And really at the end of the Cold War, we really saw this military as a wonderful tool to kind of go and rebuild the world in our image. And in reality, that's when we're at our worst. And what the Chinese, at the same time, what the Chinese had learned from the end of the Cold War is, this is not how to fight the Americans. You don't want to get into this kind of, where you're spending on your military, because Soviet Union was spending 40% of GDP on the military. And they said, no, what we're going to do is we're going to take everything they'll give us,
right,
and we're going to build up our economy and our science and technology using everything they have, because you know what she, wakes up every day and hopes? That President Trump and our Congress will have a $2 trillion defense bill. If we could just spend $2 trillion on defense, Xi Jinping would get up smiling every day, because he'd know he's that much closer to his goal. His goal is not to defeat us militarily.
right.
His goal is to bankrupt us. And that's essentially what, so
Right.
you talk to the people that, I have a friend that helped some of the sailors that were stranded in Ukraine after the Soviet Union collapsed. They're literally starving in their bases, and came in, helped them scrap their ships for money so they could feed their families. They still have like an annual reunion where they come and they celebrate this person for actually helping them get out of this predicament that the collapse of the Soviet Union left them in. When we, at the Pentagon, when we think about, hey, what's the future hold? Nowhere in our wildest dreams can we contemplate the day when the president calls up and says, stand down, we don't have any more money to pay for food or gas or even to pay your payroll. But that's what Xi Jinping contemplates. Maybe not in his lifetime, but over time, that's what they're going for. They're going for this effect where we essentially bleed ourselves out,
Right.
because we've completely lost this Eisenhower. And what happens when he leaves office? What does he say? Beware of the undue influence of the military-industrial complex, what McCain would call the congressional military-industrial complex.
Right.
Now, unfortunately, McCain was part of the problem. It was this idea that we can grow a military that will keep America safe in a globalized, internet-connected world, when authoritarians are just going to use the might of America to undermine us from within. This is where, this is where the book Stealth Work comes from. It's just this realization on my part. I've done national security my entire life. I've always thought about strategy. And the big epiphany for me was that we had it completely wrong and the Chinese had it completely right. And if we didn't fix this, that we're going to end.
So, and yet somehow we as a nation are spending trillions of dollars. We're not building out our infrastructure and having that be world class. We're not building up vocational training. I'm a huge advocate of vocational training, mainly because my electrician and plumber and HVAC, they're so darn expensive because they're 40, 50 years old. We're not getting a return on our investment, and yet there are so many young Americans today who would push us in the direction of de facto socialism, not realizing that such a development would make G wake up happy every day from what you're describing. And that is kind of where we're going. You cannot throw money at people to not work. And yet that will take the country down if we continue to build these type of social programs that don't give us a return on our investment.
Right, you were at the Fed. There's a lot of economists at the Fed, right?
And they all advocate for printing more.
So this, economist, but, I've gone through neoclassical and looked at kind of all kinds of economic disciplines. I think what I've noticed is that most of the people that make policy in this country are on the theoretical side. Mm-hmm. And then when you talk to the guys on the empirical side, they say, this doesn't fit.
No.
And so,
not in the real world.
And there's no controlling mechanism to come in and say, hey, your theories aren't working out. We need to try something different. And we're in this situation where the only option that we think that we have as a country, and I know you talk about this and write about this, is to open up the floodgates for money. But when you open up the floodgates for money in America and the sluice is built to drive it to China, then the ability to build infrastructure, the ability to build manufacturing, the ability to send your kids to school, they're taking that and it literally comes back to buy startups, high technology startups, to invest in our companies, to send their kids to our universities, to invest in our universities, all so that they can get a return on their investment
right.
of our money.
Right.
The Obama, I mean, we're doing the same thing during the coronavirus, by the way, that we did during the 2008 financial crisis, which is let's juice the system, throw money at it. And what did it do in 2008? It went to build cities in China that nobody lived in.
And now they're building more infrastructure out.
And they're also building the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
So when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative in America, we don't realize that just like the islands in the South China Sea, we paid for them. It's our money that's going into them, and it's building China's strength. And for the life of me, I talk to Congress, I talk to people in the administration. There's just a disconnect. There is kind of, there is the McCain system, which I think is kind of the standard system that we have, the establishment system in terms of national security, and I think it's leading us down to destruction.
Right.
Then there's a good book that just came out, Kill Chain by Christian Brose, I think is his name. Worked for McCain, talks about the incredible backwardness of the American military, and this is what I lived. All of these advances that Silicon Valley brought to the commercial side, they never made it to the military. Yes, trust me. You, as a military member, you live in two worlds. You live in the world that you have your iPhone, and you live in the world of your 1972 computer in the military. We're not collaborative. We're not connected, and so he nails it in terms of the problem in the military, because we haven't adopted these tools that Silicon Valley built. But what he misses is the battlefield, right? The battlefield, he says, well, we need to take these tools and become more efficient killers. No, we need to take these tools and become better at implementing them in the world that we find ourselves getting beaten in. It's not just the world that we've been talking about, economics. It's also the world of influence. Social media, the ability to take your data and convince you that something that you thought was your idea is actually somebody else's idea. And that's what the Chinese, so what Silicon Valley built, which is so incredibly powerful, is the ability to influence you to do something. What the Chinese Communist Party figured out is, okay, that thing I want you to do is not just related to a retail or commercial thing, it's also a social and a political thing.
It's much more powerful to change the way people think.
Right, so think about ISIS. Think about ISIS and their ability to use social media to influence new adherents. And then think about ISIS with a $13 trillion economy. That's what we have, right? They don't want to, it's not about terrorism. It's about adopting their worldview. And if they can slowly influence your kids, through TikTok, through all of these things.
Yep.
And as Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent gains more and more data, they gain more and more power. If you think about have you read AI Superpower? Kai-Fu Lee? Must read book. Kai-Fu Lee is China's AI kind of whatever you call him, prophet. He says that their strategy is to become the Saudi Arabia of data, because data drives artificial intelligence. Again, it goes back to Huawei builds the pipes.
Yep.
Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent takes the data, and then they bring it in, and they
execute on it
slowly. So there is kind of the addendum to the plan where they say they close up the emerging market economies. At the same time, they're continuing to slowly erode the belief in the principles and values of liberal democracy. That is their long-term plan, because even if you're not going to let them in economically, if you're going to let them in digitally, then they're going to begin to slowly kind of infuse these principles through your education system, through social media, and to the extent they're connected to our global economy, through that as well.
So international travel, I don't think is going to be coming back for a long time. And it would seem that we will have fewer Chinese students in our universities going forward. again, there is from speaking with people who are in China, there is an American backlash there. So that would seem to be a silver lining of sorts of the coronavirus. The coronavirus is also kind of a moment that I don't think we can turn back from. And my last question is, it could be, you name it, the libertarian candidate running the country. It could be anybody running the country in the coming years. Can we ever put China back where it came from, back to where it is a predator in the United States? Or, to Donald Trump's credit, will we never be able to do that? And I'm hoping you have one of two answers. But do you think that weak leadership, because most Americans right now are very adamantly opposed to China. This is something that has been exposed. It is part of the American psyche now. And do you think that is going to remain prevalent regardless of who's in office? Well,
I guess I wouldn't be here if I didn't. I mean, by the way, this is why I left the military. I knew that I needed to write about it. I needed to talk about it. I needed to, it had to be a call to action. If we don't stop the same way that kind of you wrote Fed Up. I mean, we have to wake people up out of their slumber. And now, the problem is the Chinese Communist Party has studied us, and they know Pearl Harbor. They know 9/11. They know if you get the Americans riled up, they're going to come together and they're going to fight. That's why they chose this strip path. It's a very disruptive, kind of slowly, materializing path that is built entirely for our psyche, which is don't hit us. Don't hit us. Give us a hug. Give us a hug. I'm your best friend, because that's our nature. And so, but we have to wake up from the slumber. We have to understand how the system is going. I think if we do, and it's all about so you're saying, as you say, I think, certainly I see it on the Hill. Americans are starting to wake up and say, hey, we've got a problem. They don't know what the problem is, right? And they don't know therefore they don't know what the solutions are. But I think they're starting to now ask the questions,
there's an awareness.
Right? That's where it starts. And if we could now begin to say, okay, theoretical economists that said, hey, globalization is great for everybody, maybe that's not the case, and we need to kind of rethink some, let's become a little bit more pragmatic and practical, like the Chinese, and a lot less theoretical, and say, okay, this is working, this is not working, and begin to fix this thing. I think we're on the path. I think we're 3 years, solid, good 3 years in this thing. The biggest thing that I think, if we could cut off the flow of capital to China, I think you'd see a tremendous change. Now, are there going to be banks that are taking a haircut? Absolutely, but they're going to take more of a haircut if they keep going. So, I am net positive. I'm bullish on America. I'm bullish on the free market, because I think we're going to. I've been to Europe. The tide has turned in Europe. I know the Japanese and the Koreans are like, China. Because you ask the Japanese, do you want the Chinese to protect you? Right? Okay, well then, so.
Oh, right.
So
we have the allies lined up.
They're lined up.
And the coronavirus has, if we need it for them to be more focused than they were before, the fact that people don't realize that the shutdowns were overdone for a very simple reason. World leaders were operating in the dark.
Right.
They had absolutely no idea. They had no data in hand. As I've said before,
they still don't.
But
other than what we ourselves have collected,
we still don't have data in hand to this day. And this was all under the auspices.
Which tells you the coronavirus is not as bad,
right,
as we originally.
Or that it evolves, and that there are, clearly what's happened in China. If you see the packed Beijing auto show recently, they've clearly figured out some things that they haven't shared with the rest of the world. But if the coronavirus is not a global wake-up call, I can't say what is. You have all these countries' economies on their knees. So I mean, it's like knock, knock, knock. Leverage is not your friend. Look at what's happened because you've had this event occur with all this leverage that was built up in the background. We can't keep trying to do the same thing and expecting a different outcome for yet another cliche. So, anyways, you've actually helped me draw the link between DC and the Fed in one more way that's got me fed up. So you continue on your mission. I'll continue on mine. Thank you for spending this time with me.
And we'll meet in the middle.
Let's meet in the middle, and let's keep the darned American dream alive. I mean, I'm going to go find an old pin that says "I like Ike" and wear it, and people are going to ask me about it, and you will have inspired me to tell them the story. So I thank you so much.
Thank you.